Thank you, Dr. Barch. It was an important talk, both conceptually and practically. I liked it a lot. Thank you. The Lieber Prize winner gets a chance to choose the Maltz Prize winner. The Maltz Prize winner is chosen for it's specifically identified as a young person, selected for promise and potential. And our Maltz Prize winner for today is Nicole Karcher. She comes to us as an assistant professor, no surprise, at WashU, and Dr. Barch and Dr. Karcher work together. Dr. Karcher was educated at William and Mary College for her master's degree. For her PhD, she went to the University of Missouri and then did an internship in clinical psychology and psychosis at Vanderbilt. Right after she finished that, she returned to WashU to take a postdoctoral fellowship, NIMH fellowship there, and she's been there ever since. Her professional activities right now are revolving around her K Award. Her K Award is looking for predictors of psychotic-like experiences in childhood. Now, all of us know that full-blown schizophrenia happens somewhere between, what, I'll just say 15 and 25, 15 and 30, 14 and whatever, that age range. But in childhood, there are thought to be there are psychotic-like experiences that occur, and this is what Dr. Karcher studies, and looking at the role of risk and resilience in focusing on that and trying to treat it. She teaches a lot and supervises trainees. She's already an editorial board member for the Biological Psychiatry Global Open Science and for our Biological Psychiatry magazine journal. Her interests focus on risk and resilience in childhood. And if you look at her CV, although although she's a young scientist, her CV actually is already very broad and depthful. So I think it's not going to be long before she's going to be in the running for other kinds of prizes in the field. Anyway, this is Dr. Karcher, and she's going to talk about identifying risk factors for early psychosis spectrum symptoms. Dr. Karcher.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Wow, this is such a treat to be here today. And incredible to follow in Dr. Barch's steps in that amazing talk that she gave. So I am going to talk a little bit about some of my work that I've been doing. This is going to be in some ways some snapshots, the highlights reel, if you will, of some of the work that we've been doing recently and looking at early psychosis spectrum symptoms in childhood and adolescence. And this talk is going to focus a lot more on the risk side of things. But as Dr. Tominga was kind of pointing at, we're increasingly recognizing that we need to be having a more balanced view, not just risk, but also protective or resilience factors. So today, what I'm going to talk about is much of my work that's stemming from this K23 award, where I've been looking at large-scale data sets, specifically the adolescent brain cognitive development study data, to really understand who is at risk for worsening psychosis spectrum symptoms and who is experiencing more benign or developmentally normative symptoms. But before I get any further, I want to talk a little bit about the spectrum of psychosis. So historically, when we think about the word psychosis, because there's so much power in language, right? When we think about the word psychosis, we think about something that is on this side of the continuum, something that's diagnosable. We think about an individual who is diagnosed maybe with schizophrenia, has hallucinations, so they have a belief, in something with full conviction. But what we're increasingly recognizing is rather than it being in a box, something that's diagnosed or not, that there's a whole spectrum that exists. And everybody, including everybody in this room, is somewhere on this spectrum. And the interesting thing that I find is it's not a static spectrum. across our life, we might vary a little bit in this spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, we have, I'd say, most individuals. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have a diagnosable psychotic disorder. And in between, we have what I've termed psychotic-like experiences. These are things like unusual thoughts, so maybe superstitions. Some of us in this room maybe have a lucky number. It's not necessarily grounded super in reality, but it's something that we place special emphasis on. Maybe sometimes we feel suspicious of people. We have maybe a little bit of cultural mistrust. Maybe there's certain times in our life, maybe especially when we are stressed or, a worldwide pandemic, say, where we might feel a little bit more superstitious or more suspicious. Or we might experience perceptual distortions. Many of us in the room have probably had an experience where we've heard our name called in a crowd and then realized no one was calling our name. Or we felt our phone vibrate and then realized that our phone actually wasn't vibrating. We're having a perception without that actual sensation. For most of us, this doesn't cause a lot of distress. This doesn't cause us a lot of problems. But we're recognizing that for some, that they might be a little bit higher up on the spectrum, and maybe some of these experiences are associated with distress or are associated with mild problems in school or work or ability to make friends. And that's where a lot of my interest lies. How can we tell which children and which adolescents are going to continue to move up this spectrum and move into this more problematic range where it's causing a lot of distress and a lot of problems, and who's going to stay more in this kind of mild range where it's not particularly clinically relevant. So when we talk about childhood and adolescent psychotic-like experiences, I fully recognize that this is a heterogeneous construct. And what I mean by that is some of these youth are endorsing things like imaginary friends, things that are relatively benign, maybe transient experiences that will go away over time. So maybe more in this not clinically relevant experiences. And then some of these youth are endorsing types of experiences like suspiciousness or unusual beliefs, but maybe they're actually indicative of other types of psychopathology. Maybe these youth will go on to develop something like depression or anxiety or ADHD. But there is a subset of youth who are endorsing these, and they are going to go on to develop some sort of later psychosis spectrum symptoms. And this is where a lot of my work is interested in identifying really this top half of youth who are going to go on to develop some sort of clinically relevant, diagnosable condition later. So what stands in our way of really early identification and early intervention efforts, which is really the ultimate goal, is helping people who are on this path toward developing a diagnosable condition. But what stands in our way of doing so? And this is really where my talk will highlight some of our work in kind of delving into these questions. So the first thing that stands in our way is we're not 100% sure who is at risk for developing worsening symptoms. A lot of times when I talk to people about these things, they say, well, they're so common in childhood and adolescence. According to ABCD, 60% of children endorse at least one psychotic-like experience. But of course, not 60% of children are going to go on to develop schizophrenia. So we don't know yet who is actually at risk for worsening symptoms. Second, we don't fully understand that pathway. So we don't fully understand what goes into going from, say, a lucky number or a mild perceptual distortion into developing a diagnosable condition. What is that pathway? What does that look like cognitively? What does that look like in the brain? What does that look like in terms of one's environment and their experiences that they're having? And how can we put all those pieces together to understand this pathway, or, as it is probably likely, multiple pathways? And then lastly, from a prevention standpoint, knowing which risk factors to target to try to mitigate or reduce, and which protective factors to promote to really help these individuals from attenuating these symptom trajectories, from worsening symptoms. My work I'll be discussing today, but my work in general, uses large-scale data sets in order to try to start to answer some of these questions. So the one I'll be talking about today, as we've now discussed multiple times, is the ABCD study. So this is the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study data set. This is a large longitudinal study tracking about 11,875 youth from age 9 into adulthood. And it's across the United States. WashU is a site, but there's 20 other sites across the United States. And one of the things I've done is a part of this NIMH grant that I received is I added a small study onto the ABCD study where I interview youth and their caregivers about psychosis spectrum symptoms to try to really better understand who is at risk for worsening symptoms. So these are youth who they haven't had a lot of psychopathology in their life, or maybe they've had some depression or anxiety, or they've had what we're terming persistent distressing psychotic-like experiences. So I'm going to get a little bit into what I mean by that in a moment. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is some of my work that I've done understanding who is at risk for worsening symptoms. So I've kind of alluded to this, the entire first part of this talk, which is, there's a lot of kind of messiness to childhood and adolescent psychotic-like experiences. And I live in that messiness, where I'm trying to understand what are some factors that might differentiate those youth who are having benign or relatively transient experiences versus those who are going to have worsening symptoms. And two factors that we think might be particularly important is the distress that's associated with those experiences and how long you're having those experiences. So I'm going to take us through a concrete example to try to illustrate this point. Let's take the question, did you suddenly start to see unusual things that you never saw before, like shapes floating in front of you? Maybe this has happened to you before. But many times when I talk to people, they'll say, that's happened, but it doesn't really bother me when it happens. Maybe it's a little annoying or something, but it's not scary or concerning. It's not very distressing. So you can imagine if someone's saying it doesn't bother them, that doesn't seem like something that's particularly clinically relevant. It's just kind of a one and done thing. But if I told you that happened to me, I saw shapes floating in front of me, and I found that to be very scary, now that starts to take on a little bit more clinical relevance. Likewise, we think persistence is an important aspect of this. If I told you I saw a shape floating in front of me and it happened one time and then never happened to me again, doesn't seem particularly clinically relevant. But if I told you that over the last couple of years, it has been increasingly happening more and more often now again, that starts to take on a little bit more clinical relevance. Perhaps it's the two together, right? That with more persistence, if I'm having that, in addition to having distress associated with that, perhaps that's the most clinically relevant. And really, that's what we've been finding in our work. So I've been following these youth using data from age 9, and now what we're looking at is youth that are endorsing high levels of distress associated with these experiences for 2 or more of the last 3 years. And I've been interviewing them, and what we find is that these youth show already small effect size impairments in a range of areas, including in cognition. They're already showing differences in their brain that we can see. They're showing greater environmental exposures. And so one of the things that I've been interested in is using different techniques. So one of the ones I'll talk about is using a form of machine learning called random forest regressions, which can take all of the incredible amount of data. Because one of the things I didn't underscore thus far is one of the most amazing things about ABCD is the vast amount of data that ABCD has. Not only does it have information about symptoms, but it has information about cognition, brain, their environment, their cultural values, their physical health, incredible amounts of data that we can put together. But oftentimes when we look at data, we'll look at them somewhat piecemeal. Well, what does the cognition look like? Or what does the brain look like? Or what does the environment look like? So some of these we call them multivariate approaches, where we can take multiple variables together and really understand which are the most important factors differentiating, say, persistent distressing PLEs, persistent distressing psychotic-like experiences, from low-level psychotic-like experiences. And I know this is a little bit busy, but stay with me. I'm going to break it down for a moment. What we did is we put all of these into this random forest regression. We took symptoms, we took developmental milestone delays, so delays in your speech or your ability to walk. We took family history of psychosis. We took brain metrics, including metrics of resting state functional connectivity and prefrontal thickness. We took cognition. We took adverse childhood events. We call them ACEs. And we took types of symptoms like depression and anxiety, and we put them all into this model. And we said, well, what are the most important factors predicting persistent distressing PLEs versus low-level PLEs? The bigger the circle and the more red the circle, the more important the metric. I think one of the interesting takeaways that we found is one of the most important metrics predicting persistent distressing PLEs: adversity, adverse childhood events. So these are things like bullying, financial adversity, traumatic exposures. Those were amongst the most, almost as important as depression or anxiety, was adverse childhood events. And if you look at this chart, much more important than, say, even family history of psychosis. So we can use these multivariate techniques, even though each of these individually was a predictor, to tell us a little bit more of what might be the most important predictors differentiating these types of groups. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about that pathway. How can we use data over time to really understand how individual psychotic-like experiences start worsening and how they develop into maybe worsening symptoms overall? So what we've done here is, again, we take a lot of different predictors. In this case, I'm going to focus on some of our work with cognition in the brain. Now, we know that in childhood and adolescence, this is a really formative time for brain development. And so we want to see, this is over the course of 6 years, we want to see what these children and youth, what their brains look like and what their cognitive patterns look like over time. But most importantly, a lot of theories of the development of psychosis say that it's really genetics and environment, and then pathophysiological changes in brain cognition over time that leads to worsening. But we haven't had the data up until now to really test some of those theories. With ABCD, we now have that ability. We've been tracking these youth from age 9 all the way up to now they're teenagers. And we can see, do these changes in cognition and the brain patterns, do those changes link some of these genetic and environmental contributions to worsening symptoms? So first, what I'll say is we do in fact see that, so what we have here are different types of cognition and brain metrics. So we looked at things like cortical thickness, and we looked at working memory and processing speed, and we saw how that changed over time. And we saw that compared to people with low-level PLEs, people with persistent distressing PLEs did show lower, especially processing speed, and something called picture vocabulary, which is, as it sounds, your ability to identify pictures with words. We saw worsening metrics of those over time over the course of these 6 years. But most importantly, what we found is that those changes in cognition in the brain partially explain the relationship between the experience of bullying with worsening symptoms. So we're seeing, I don't want to go so far as to say a causal pathway, but we're seeing something that is consistent with that type of pathway, that you experience genetic difficulties and environmental risk factors, including bullying, leading to cognitive changes and changes in the brain over time, and then worsening symptoms. and that this explains up to 20% of the relationship between the experience of things like bullying with worsening symptoms over time. And the last thing I'll talk about is a little bit of our work understanding which risk factors to target and which resilience factors to potentially promote. So one of the things the field, you'll hear this a lot, precision psychiatry, which is a really important area. It's saying that maybe we've kind of been grouping people together for far too long, that we take large groups of people and we say, your brains are all the same, we should treat them all the same. But we know that that's not necessarily the case, that my brain and your brain might not look exactly the same. So we're trying to take more precise estimates. And this is one of the things we've been working on for the understanding of psychotic-like experiences. So one of the things that we've been doing is you can use some of these other large-scale data sets, like Enigma, where they have groups of patients who have been diagnosed with conditions like schizophrenia or depression. And you can say, okay, what do the brains look like of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia? Now let's take an individual who has persistent distressing psychotic-like experiences. How much does their brain look like the brain of an individual diagnosed with schizophrenia? So maybe a little bit of an oversimplification of the process, but you get the point. So this is another busy slide, but I want to point your attention to a couple of things. The first is, so we did this not just with schizophrenia, so people diagnosed with schizophrenia, but we also did this with bipolar disorder, depression, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and metabolic conditions. And we said, how much does an individual with persistent distressing PLEs, how much does their brain look like the brain of an individual diagnosed with any one of these conditions? But we also did that for all the other groups of interest, and today I'll focus on low-level PLEs. So if you're looking at this in blue, this light blue, you can see that the individuals with persistent distressing PLEs showed brains more similar to those of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, almost one standard deviation closer to those of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, compared to the low-level PLEs that did not show brains that were significantly in that direction. But it wasn't just schizophrenia. Intriguingly, food for thought, was also some of the strong effect sizes came for Alzheimer's disease, consistent with some neurodevelopmental hypotheses of the development of psychosis. So we saw here that it wasn't just cortically, it was also subcortically, that individuals with persistent distressing PLEs are already showing brains more in the direction of disorders like psychosis. So that's on the risk side of things. We're starting to, and we're increasingly doing this in our work, is starting to really understand how can we attenuate some of these symptoms? How can we lessen or reduce some of these problematic symptoms? So one of these lines of research we've looked at is environmental exposures, like experiences of discrimination, and how those are linked to psychotic-like experiences. And we show that especially from marginalized racial and ethnic groups like Black and Hispanic youth, we show strong links between experiences of discrimination and psychotic-like experiences. So you can see that briefly here. So when you do all of these different group comparisons, you can see that these youth are experiencing a lot of adversity and that it's related to their experiences of psychotic-like experiences. But importantly, and what I want us to really focus on, is this notion that social support buffered some of these associations. So when you took the amount of friendships that an individual had, that helped to lessen. It didn't completely eliminate the association, but it helped to lessen the relationship to worsening symptoms. And this is really consistent with this idea that oftentimes with psychotic-like experiences, there can be this othering. You can feel alone, you can feel different, and that if you can work to buffer that feeling of being othered, perhaps you can improve someone's symptoms. So future, where are we going to take this? We're going to take this in a lot of different directions. There are a lot of work to be done. The first direction is trying to really use some more of these multivariate techniques, taking into account all of the information we have to develop a risk calculator. Can we predict precisely who is going to worsen and who's going to develop persistent distressing and then attenuated psychotic symptoms. The next is work towards developing some sort of early screening program. Ambitious, I know, but it is where the field is going, towards prevention. Think about all the possibilities of what we could do if we could identify youth prior to the incidence of significant impairments. If we could identify youth prior to problems in school, prior to the diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, what could we do in terms of prevention? So that's really where I think the next frontier of work is working with the schools, working with primary care to really develop some sort of universal screening program. And then once you have that, you need to have something to do with those youth that you've identified. So having some sort of linkage to care initiative where we can have risk factors to target, reducing stress, things like that, and resilience factors to promote, supporting families, supporting psychoeducation for understanding these symptoms, and supporting those youth who are having difficulties with bullying and other types of adversities to really promote that social support function. With that, I'd love to thank you for your attention and for being here, and I'll take a question.
We have time for a question. Is there any questions for Dr. Karcher? Here we go.
Okay, that was beautifully done. I mean, the biopsychosocial approach to this, we know it's complicated. We know it's not just polygenetic, neurodevelopmental.
Right.
So all this, I'm always looking at what you can do because you identify early, you work with these people early. It makes a huge difference. So the clinical high-risk individuals, I mean, we can identify them. Are you starting to be involved in any programs like the Headspaces that they do with Patrick McGorry in Australia, where you're taking these kids out, you're working with cognitive, education, you're working on, doing the silly little things like Brain HQ and Lumosity, working on processing speed, which we know helps if you work on that and identify these kids with low processing speed, that will improve their social interaction, which will then go on and help with the bullying and the people that are having the PLEs, that you work with them and challenge that, so a little CBT. Are there any of these programs that are coming out? Or do you have a model?
That is such a fantastic question, and I thank you for bringing it up. Well, this is the beautiful thing about the state of the field right now is, we're not starting from scratch, right? We have these incredible initiatives that have come before us. So I haven't started on any of those programs yet, but the lovely thing is that that scaffolding is there. So like you're saying, we already know that there's certain things that work with clinical high risk or are starting to work. They show at least some evidence of improvement. What I'm saying is, well, now we just need to move it a little bit earlier. I think for a long time, for very understandable reasons, we focused on these kind of high-risk paradigms when someone is already experiencing at least attenuated psychotic symptoms. And that's really important. But we just now need to bring these programs down. And so you did a beautiful job of kind of highlighting of what we could do. We just now need the money and the resources in order to do that, to bring it. Because it is only very recently when and I haven't been doing this long, I don't want to pretend that I have, when I started, publishing some of this work, like 6 years ago, something like that, we would always get these comments like, this is so silly, the effect sizes are so small, this is so noisy, why would you target children that don't have a diagnosable condition? And within the pattern of 5 years, we now see that already the field is changing.
There's one more question,
Oh,
and I want to allow this lady to ask her question.
Please, thank you.
Not necessarily to push it off to the coffee.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that because I was curious about the data. All this talk about AI now, right? And I'm wondering where did you get that subset? Because it was a pretty impressive number of all the kids. Maybe you mentioned it, but I was just curious. where
You're
those...
talking about like the persistent, distressing, psychotic-like experiences? Or?
no, you said that you had like 16,000. You were following the 16,000. Where did you get that data set?
That is the ABCD study. So it's a publicly available data set. So technically, anybody in this room, if you had a research question, you could access that data. So that's 11,875 kiddos that have been followed across the country, a relatively normative sample that we're able to see who are those individuals who are worsening over time versus those who have these pockets of resilience.
Did they have symptoms initially, or they're just random?
It's relatively random. So, you had to be near a study site. You had to be in the catchment of that study site. But they just went to the schools. They oversampled for twins and siblings. But it was a relatively normative sample.
And you can follow up at the...
Yes, please. Any other questions, please feel free to find me, and I'm always happy to, at the coffee break, and answer more questions. Thank you.